I want to welcome you all here tonight. My name is Megan Radecki. It's my pleasure to serve as your director here at the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies at Grand Valley State University, and I congratulate you all on getting out of the house on this cold night and making it here. But we are all hardy Michiganders. Isn't this what we should be doing all the time in winter so as not to hate it, right? Well, we are thrilled to see you. A special welcome to our Hauenstein Center members, our Grand Valley students, including some from our Cook Leadership Academy, and a super special welcome to members from our local chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution. It's the Sophie Dumarsac Campo chapter, as well as some of their friends. They're here tonight. Obviously, the story of Angelica Schuyler Church is right up their alley, as they are all descendants of individuals from the Revolution. So thank you all. Can we get a show of hands, everyone who's here from the DAR tonight? Fabulous. Shameless plug, we think it would be delightful if you also wanted to be members of the Hauenstein Center, but we're so glad you could join us here tonight for this initial program. We are so excited to be kicking off 2026 with a special program that really focuses in on America 250. So as many of you know, this summer we will be celebrating our country's 250th anniversary or birthday, depending how you like to celebrate. And throughout the year, we will be featuring programming that hits on that theme. Tonight is just the first part of that. And what better person to view the American Revolution through than the eyes of Angelica Schuyler Church? It was very funny as we were preparing for tonight. We've had this program planned for a long time. But when you say Angelica Schuyler Church, I had people just kind of look at me like, oh, yeah, that sounds interesting. And then I say Hamilton's sister-in-law. And they're like, oh, right. So no matter how you came or how you were attracted to the topic, we're thrilled you're here, and we know you're going to learn a lot. Before we turn our attention to Angelica, I'd like to introduce another extraordinary leader to you from our Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy, which is the student leadership program that we run as part of the Hauenstein Center. Shakana Harlan is here tonight to share her leadership minute and also introduce our featured speaker. Let me tell you a little bit about Shakana. Shakana is a junior at Grand Valley State University pursuing a Bachelor of Science in Legal Studies and Political Science, along with a paralegal certificate and a minor in accounting. She currently serves as Vice President of Alpha Pi Sigma, Grand Valley's Criminal Justice Honor Society, and as Interim President of the university's NAACP chapter. This past summer, Shakana interned at the Third Circuit Court of Michigan under the Honorable Judge Green, gaining hands-on experience in legal research, courtroom procedure, and professional ethics. Her career goal is to attend law school immediately after undergrad, with current interests in corporate law, criminal law, and environmental. Outside of her academic and leadership roles, she enjoys experimenting with new matcha recipes and spending time at the beach, especially Grand Haven. Friends, please join me in welcoming Shakana.
Good evening, everyone. As you will soon learn, Angelica's experience reflects a broader truth about leadership. Readiness often follows responsibility rather than preceding it. This truth is something that I've learned over the course of the past year. In January of 2025, Grand Valley State University's NAACP chapter was rechartered after 7 years of deactivation. I was a part of the initial rebuilding process, serving as the interim second vice president. The following semester, we were officially recognized on campus and welcomed back. That moment felt historic and exciting all at once. Shortly after that milestone, our interim president graduated, and our first vice president left the country for a study abroad program. I was a sophomore at the time, serving as interim second vice president, and I suddenly found myself in an empty space of leadership where 2 strong leaders had just been. I was next in the line of succession, a position I hadn't expected to come into so soon. At that moment, I felt lost. My role was still intern, and while I had helped with the rechartering process, I didn't yet have the connections or the experience I thought leadership required. I didn't have formal authority, and I didn't have the security of knowing how things would turn out. It felt like I was being asked to fill an impossible role, to lead something brand new with no blueprint. And I know many students feel this way. We feel that we need more experience, more confidence, or more permission before we can step forward. What I did have, though, was a deep sense of responsibility. I knew that if I didn't step up, the chapter could lose momentum once again, just as we had fought to bring it back. I felt a responsibility, not just to the organization, but to the students who are counting on it to exist and to serve, standing for something on this campus. I won't pretend I felt ready. In fact, I knew I wasn't. There were moments of doubt, pressure, and fear, moments where it would have been easier to wait or step back. But I made the conscious decision that the chapter mattered more than my fear, and the work mattered more than my comfort. The mission had mattered more than my uncertainty. The chapter deserved my willingness to take a risk. So I chose to show up consistently. I chose to be dependable when things were unclear, and I chose to lead with intention when the outcome wasn't guaranteed. I focused on rebuilding engagement, strengthening communication, and creating spaces where students felt connected to the mission again. Over time, that consistency turned into trust, and that trust turned into growth. By December of 2025, we had over 285 student allies in a chapter that was stable, engaged, and moving forward. That same December, so this past December, after serving alongside an entirely interim executive committee for nearly a year, I ran for election and I was officially elected president. But the most important leadership lesson came long before the title ever did. That experience taught me that leadership isn't about certainty or authority. It's about choosing responsibility when it would have been easier to wait. I didn't become ready before I stepped up. I became ready because I did. Angelica Schuyler Church didn't become influential because she was ready. She became ready because she led. That is what leadership looks like then and now. My name is Shakana Harlan, and I'm a leader. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker and offer a brief biography. For more details about tonight's guest speaker, please check your program. Raised on a farm in the town of Angelica, New York, Molly Beer is an award-winning nonfiction writer interested in history, women, politics, and place. Angelica joins Molly's body of award-winning nonfiction that grapples with politics of place, from travel and the environment to women's history. She has served as an Olive B. O'Connor Fellow in Creative Writing at Colgate University and currently teaches at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Please join me in welcoming Molly to the stage.
I'd say the future is safe. Thank you, Shakana. Good evening. Thank you to everyone who braved the cold and for being here this evening. And thank you to those of you who are maybe wiser than the brave and zooming in from home. So I don't know about you, but I'm not really a fan of birthdays. They get me in a weird space because you got to do the measures. You got to be like, where have I gotten to? Where did I start? Have I made it, cover the distance? Oh my goodness, how many years? And et cetera. And, there's a lot of emotional baggage that comes with that. So this year, the 250th birthday anniversary of the United States, I think we're in the same space. So this January, as we ring in the 250th year of the United States being maybe united, definitely states, as we celebrate, as we commemorate, as we contemplate the progress that we've made, the distance that we've covered, I would like everyone, I'd like to urge everyone to heed the advice of one of this nation's founders. Not Angelica, this one. Abigail Adams. So you all know she said, remember the ladies, but she said more than that, of course. She said, I long to hear that you have declared an independency. This is her writing her husband in March of 1776. So a couple months before the Declaration of Independence comes about. I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound to any laws in which we have no voice or representation. That your sex are naturally tyrannical is a truth so thoroughly established as to admit of no dispute. But such of you as wish to be happy willingly give up the harsh title of master for the more tender and endearing one of friend. It always gets reduced to remember the ladies, and I'm like, I like all the other stuff just as much. So, John Adams, her husband, he gets her letters, and he's on this, committee of 5 down here. You can see the representation happening in this painting by John Trumbull of the Declaration of Independence being submitted to Congress. And, as we all know, it says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Now, when I was a kid, everyone told me, well, they meant everybody. They didn't mean just men. They meant, everybody. They just used men generally. But if you look at that room, they were not. So this was, troubling to me as a kid. And I think it's troubling that we went from 1776 to 1920, 144 years, before we have votes for women. And now 106 years after that, we're still asking the question of whether Americans will vote for women. And that's a quarter millennium. And I think as a kid, this was, so when I was researching Angelica, she had a house in Windsor for part of her very traveled life, right by Windsor Castle. And so I went to see Windsor Castle, and I was touring around, and there's this big line of people around St. George's Chapel, and I get in the line, I'm like, oh, everyone's here to see the architecture. But when I got to where the line was eventually going, I realized, no, we were all there to mourn, I didn't realize this, to mourn Elizabeth II, whose grave I found myself standing in front of. And I thought of the country that we declared independence from has been led for the majority of the time since by women, heads of state. And that also is confusing to me. Now, one of the reasons I think that this was discordant in my mind is because I actually grew up in Angelica, New York, as they said, which is, this beautiful town. Welcome to Angelica, a town where history lives. We take this very, very seriously. All of our shops are antique stores. And it's still that map of the original, before there was a town and they were just drawing it. It's still that size. That's our park circle in the middle. It was designed as to be an arrondissement after Paris by Angelica and her family when they founded the community in 1805. And so as a child, I rode the Angelica Central School Bus past Angelica's house here at the top left on my way to the Angelica Central School. And then after school, I'd walk down to the Angelica Free Library where Angelica's portrait was above the mantle. And so I just grew up in this space where a female founder was ubiquitous. I think it had an impact on me, and I think it made me think of women as, someone who could have the house that was, the memorial. They could have the town named after them. They could have, but also I learned history through her. So I didn't learn like Thomas Jefferson was, this president. And I was like, oh, he knew Angelica. And I was like, well, he must have been important. Alexander Hamilton, he knew Angelica. Oh, and so as a girl, she didn't just let me feel like I could be an American woman and also be important, but she was a way into history, because sometimes if you don't have a way to see yourself in history, it's hard to think of how that would resonate. So anyway, I wrote a book about her. As an educator, I saw Hamilton. She's spectacular in Hamilton. She's so charismatic. She's, just this incredible figure. And, those of us who were parenting during the pandemic when Hamilton came out on Disney Plus and all the kids knew all the words to every song, that was really thrilling too. So I just watched all these kids plugging into history, and I saw the girls lighting up with Angelica. And so I was like, this is magnificent, but this is historical fiction. And I was like, there are 145 biographies of Thomas Jefferson in my library. We could have one of Angelica. So I chased down her life, and she's just fascinating. So she's just not, of course, women, their names are just sort of plastic. She's not born Angelica. She's born Angelica Schuyler in Albany in the Royal Colony of New York, which her ancestors 9 generations back had set up as a sort of colony within the colony of New Netherland, which was Rensselaerwyck, and Beverwyck was the main town. And her mother, Catharina van Rensselaer, was a direct descendant of the Dutch diamond dealer who invented the town of what is now Albany, and never came, but designed it. So Angelica drawing my town of Angelica was following in her ancestral footprints. But this is what it looked like about the time she was a child there, and as a colonial girl, and small town, about the same size as my small town. Very Dutch. When she was a young girl, Dutch was the family language, the hearth language. It was a British military fort. That's the star at the top of the picture of the map here. So there was a British fort, but the business was taking place in Dutch, like the family business, the local business, and so forth. Then the French and Indian War happened, and the British were quartering troops in everybody's second best bed, and English infiltrated the households and the families, and became more broadly known by the Dutch community that had, been living there for 100 years without switching languages. But the Dutch is still very prominent, and these are some of the women that are Angelica's forebears, and I just want to show you them because this was a world that was very heavily, what's my word? I want to say it's run by women. So in the center is her mother. This is Catharina van Rensselaer Schuyler. During the wars, she's running the household, she's running the businesses, she's, and the household isn't like you and your, umpteen children, but it's you and your umpteen children and all of your servants and all the people who depend upon you and the livestock and the, what are we going to eat all winter scenario. And then on the right, we have Margaret B. Livingston. She's the mother of Robert R. Livingston, also of that Committee of Five who wrote the Declaration of Independence, and who is Angelica's cousin, and that becomes a thing during the Louisiana Purchase. They're very close. So Margaret Livingston has a lot of influence on Angelica too. At this point, how do you handle so many children? Will you send them to other people's houses? If you want mine, they are available. And then that way they could read different books, they could learn the ways of different households, and also children behave better in other people's homes. So Angelica spent a lot of time with her extended family at Livingston Manor down they didn't call it Hudson's River because that's an Englishman. That's the North River. And then on this far left is her great aunt. And I love this picture because Elizabeth Stotts Wendell Schuyler had 11 children and a couple husbands, and and she's a widow for a long time, and she runs a business, and there she is reading a book. And to be a woman and to have time to read a book says a lot about your environment in which you live. Okay, so these are the powerful women in Angelica's life. But in the broader context of powerful women, you have to think that during Angelica's childhood, there are female heads of state. This is Empress Catherine, later Catherine the Great of Russia. This is Archduchess Maria Theresa of Austria and Hungary, who, also her 11th child is Marie Antoinette, who is exactly the same age as Angelica, and they have their little parallel stories. So there are women in power. These are massively influential women in the sort of sphere that she is aware of. Monarchy, you might be way out of the way in Albany, but you're not. You're still sort of connected to these global issues, especially once the French and Indian War, which is the 7 Years' War in Europe, comes to your doorstep in Albany, as it does for Angelica. So if you're going to have powerful women, you need help. And unfortunately, this is also part of our legacy as a country, is that women's liberation has long been dependent on the oppression of other people. And so we want to acknowledge that. This is a painting that's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art that I think is just so important. It's the child of the Van Rensselaer family with a servant, and enslavement in colonial New York was ubiquitous. Slavery is legal throughout the colonies by the beginning of the Revolutionary War. Angelica's mother, of course, Katerina Van Rensselaer, she's born in 1734. This actually is probably a boy, not a girl. Don't be confused by the gown. Boys are not breeched until they're really ready for that. I have the picture of the shoes because just to give a sense of how entangled these relationships were in New York State, or the colony of New York, in the Dutch families, is that when a child was very young, they would be matched with an enslaved child. A master child would be matched with an enslaved child. And they would have a ceremony, like a little miniature wedding. And the master child would give the enslaved child a pair of shoes as a symbol of that bondage. And then they were raised together from childhood into their roles together with the idea that they would be partnered through their lives. And so that's sort of the nature of the system in which Angelica was raised, just to enable the reading. Okay, so that's the environment in which she is percolating, right, as a young child. She is sent to school. She's sent to school in New York. She and her sister Elizabeth, they go to boarding school in New York for a year, and they study French. And they're looked after by Livingstons and their other relatives in New York City. And then things start to get hot because it's the Stamp Act riots, and they return to Albany after that. And they stay that year, but there is a Stamp Act riot that comes right to their doorstep, and things are pretty tense in New York. And so Britain sends a new governor to New York, Harry Moore. And he arrives in 1766, and the Stamp Act has been repealed, but things are still hot, and we need to cool them down. And this is where Angelica first starts to appear in the political sphere. Mind you, she is 10 years old. It's 1766. The royal governor comes to Albany. He wants to establish ties with the colony, keep the peace, make some friends. Everyone's like, we can't like this. The tenants are rising up. We've got, the Sons of Liberty are roiled up, and, we just want to keep things calm. And so one thing that happens is that the Schuylers send their daughter, Angelica, to live with the royal governor and his family in the fort on the tip of Manhattan Island, the British fort, for the winter, as part of their family, as a member of their family, as a sort of signifier of the relationship. upriver, downriver, the colonial administration and the royal administration, the Dutch and the English, all sort of trying to be like, no, see, we're friends and things are okay. And so from the royalty to now, this has been a system for women, right? Marie Antoinette marries the Dauphin of France as a teenager to help keep a peace between those countries, to to embody an alliance between them. So this is not an uncommon role for girls in a monarchical system. So that's when she's 10. But we don't see her again much. They do spend more time in politics in New York. She gets to know the Tryons after Henry Moore dies. She's dining en famille, and she's getting a very up close and personal education in politics. But she's absorbing it. You know, you're at the dinner table, you're part of the conversation. But the next time we see her, the war is once the war starts. So in 1775, war breaks out, the Continental Congress meets, and they appoint leadership for the Continental Army. Now we get General Washington, of course, he's the Virginian. We get 2 Massachusetts generals because the war is happening in Boston. And then Charles Lee takes control of the Southern Department, and Philip Schuyler, Angelica's father, is the commander of the Northern Department, which will immediately begin preparing for the invasion of Canada. And so Angelica's house turns into a military headquarters, and so she's right in the middle of it. And her father is the Northern commander, and she's playing a role in that. She's 20 years old. She writes this letter on July 4th, 1776, to her father. He's out, you've got Fort Ticonderoga, and Fort Anne and Fort Edward. You've got all these upstate New York forts, which may seem like they're in the middle of nowhere, but when you're in the age of sail, that Hudson River Champlain corridor is of massive strategic importance, with Fort Ticonderoga on Lake Champlain being the linchpin of that system. And so she writes her father with the news. She hasn't read the Declaration of Independence yet. It's coming by express, but it doesn't arrive, that quickly in Albany. We hear no news from the army at Illinois, and the idea of a ministerial fleet is lost in our disgust of American perfidy. Mr. Matthews is condemned, and Wallace, Jones, and Beach are confined, and the fleet were to have attacked the city on the day on which the conspirators were to have assassinated our worthy generals. So she's reporting on politics to her father, who is one of the foremost generals in the Continental Army on current events, as a young person. So she's already now stepping into these roles. Women didn't always write. That was her mother never writes. Her mother would get Richard Varick to write her letters. So Richard Varick is always like, Mrs. Schuyler's been asking me to write to you so I'm writing you again, but I'm sorry, because Catherine Schuyler wouldn't write to her husband. She would have someone else do it. But Angelica was writing. So she starts as the general's daughter, but there's not really any room for promotion if you're a girl. And all those young officers are there, and they're all sharp elbows, like me, pick me. I want the high rank, and they're all squabbling about that. And she's stuck being Miss Schuyler as the eldest daughter. But then she meets this guy, as happens, and he's maybe a good for nothing. His name is John Carter. He comes with a letter from a friend of the Schuylers. It says, don't worry, he's a good old-fashioned Whig. You can trust him. But he's also there to audit the Northern Army because New England's pretty sure that the Dutchman commanding it has been doing funny things with the funds. And he's really good at cards, and he likes poetry, and he's English. Anyway, whatever happens, they run away and elope, and then come back and face down the general and his wife. Of course, they actually happened to elope the same week that General Schuyler lost Fort Ticonderoga to General Burgoyne, so it was a bad week for the Schuylers. But they try to stick it out through the summer. General Burgoyne is invading. He's trying to be an ally to General Schuyler as his new son-in-law. He's trying really hard to impress him. It's not going so well, and now he's working for General Gates, who comes to take Schuyler's place, and it's not going to go well for him. So they leave. They go to Boston, where he takes up, what you all hope your sons-in-law will do. He becomes a privateer. And they're in Boston, and things are, they're doing their best. So this young couple, they're really struggling. They burn down their house. The privateering doesn't go well. It goes well for a little while, then it goes not so well. I won't give it all away, but they have a privateer ship named, you're shocked, the Angelica. Okay, I'll give it away. So General Howe, he's lost, he was supposed to, reconnoiter with General Burgoyne at Saratoga, but he didn't. He thought instead, for his personal glory, he would go attack Philadelphia, which he does, and he takes Philadelphia, but then Burgoyne loses and Saratoga, and anyway, England's mad, and they need General Howe to come home and explain how the British lost at Saratoga. And so he's on this frigate called the Andromeda, being taken very quickly back to England, and they happen to see this beautiful new ship. Pine's still brand new, fresh. It's flying its pine tree flag. It's got this rattlesnake carved on the back. Beautiful ship. But that ship has mistaken them for a merchantman and is chasing them before it realizes that it's the fastest frigate the British could send to get General Howe home. And so they're quickly captured. And, to make General Howe feel better, the crew of the Andromeda gets everybody off the Angelica and then blows it up as soon as it's dark for a nice big spectacle for everybody. So the privateering doesn't go super well. And then there is a change of fortune, and it comes in the form of the Marquis de Lafayette, who arrives in Boston with the news that General Rochambeau's army is coming. And John Carter and Angelica Carter both speak French, and they have some pretty significant connections, and they vie for the position to help this the Rochambeau's army when he arrives. And they do. When Rochambeau's army arrives in Newport, nobody showed up at first, and General Rochambeau wandered around Newport looking for some tea. But a couple days later, everybody showed up. And the Carters were among them. And John Carter never left the French army from that point on. He stayed right there next to the leadership, and he became the supplier of that army. And meanwhile, Angelica stays too. They've left her little sister Peggy in charge of their Boston house, which is shocking to the French. And they stay in Newport and remain connected to the French army. And Angelica takes on the role as sort of a cultural liaison, because the French in New England, it's a little rough, Catholic, Protestant. The French and Indian War has just happened. They've had all that propaganda about how the French eat babies and salads. So the New Englanders are distrustful. But she just helps that cultural clash, not jeopardize the alliance that's going to be so important to the revolution. So she plays that role, and then she does leave briefly in the autumn of 1781. So she misses Yorktown because she is actively delivering a baby. But as soon as she can, she rushes south. She stops in Philadelphia because George Washington is there, and Martha Washington is there, even though they've just lost their son, lobbying Congress for funds. And she participates in that, and then she continues and rejoins the French army at Williamsburg, and spends the winter with them there, and then joins them on the march back. So she really feels like she's a critical part. I mean, she traveled 500 miles with a newborn and a toddler. It doesn't matter how many babysitters you have. That's hard. So she obviously felt very critical to the mission. While that doesn't get documented, and there's not a job title for that, it was a role she felt she could not be kept from, and so she did that, and she stayed with them right through. And in fact, as soon as the war was over, she sailed to France with her friends, where she got to meet their friend. Well, I don't know that she met her, but live be around Marie Antoinette. Now, this is Marie Antoinette in her portrait in 1783 and her chemise, where she's dressing in a way that sort of manifests the simplicity that the French are admiring about the Americans in the American Revolution. So in a way, Marie Antoinette is dressing like Angelica, who, a friend of theirs who's written a book about North America has described her. She's, the General Chastellux has written this book, and Angelica comes in. So she's sort of this inversion. But then she gets in trouble because France is like, oh my goodness, she's wearing muslin, which is not made in France. Also her underwear, and she's wearing like a peasant hat. So they actually had to repaint her portrait that year so that she would be more acceptable. And that's the reproduction over there. But it's a big year in France. Okay, so there's the peace treaty. That's kind of important. Also hot air balloons. Equally, very entertaining. And the Society of the Cincinnati is formed. And Angelica is there all fall with Benjamin Franklin and, not any of the John Adams and John Jay and John Carter all leave town because they can go to England now and they can get there first because from Paris is a lot faster than getting there from Boston, say. So they're gone, but she has another baby in Paris, sees the balloons, spends a lot of time with Sarah J., and spends time with the army that she is so grateful to. The French army, that the alliance that she has helped to preserve, and now she's there to recognize that role that that the French army had played, that the French king and queen had played in funding that army that came to the United States to help with that effort, and she's sort of coming to represent the country in that capacity after that event. Then her husband comes back from England. Turns out he's not John Carter after all. His name is John Barker Church, and he's cleared his former bankruptcy and made up with his family with all the money that he's made helping to supply the French. And so she has a new name. Oh, and by the way, I got a house in London for us. So after 8 years of war, she moves to London instead of home to the country she's been fighting for. But she fills this role in a similar way. She immediately steps into the role of prominent American, because she's General Schuyler's daughter. No one thinks of her as, John Barker Church's wife, an Englishwoman. She's always thought of as an American. And she travels in very illustrious circles. They buy the house right by Windsor. The Prince of Wales comes to her parties. And she's there to be like, take me seriously. We're now at peace, and I am your equal, but the American version. And as a representation of that, in terms of her showing herself as an American of the equal significance to the leading class in Europe, I think that this John Trumbull painting of her with her baby is markedly like that year's portrait of Marie Antoinette, with the hand positions, except instead of a rose, she's holding a baby. But they both have the same striped thing on their feather hat. Not an art historian, it's just a theory. The same greens, no. But even more clearly an imitation is this duo of paintings on the upper right. This is Angelica's son, Philip, and next to King George's son, Prince Octavius, painted the year before by Benjamin West, who's an American painter, but has been in England through the war. And John Trumbull, Angelica's longtime friend, paints her son in, the same outfit, but with the American, not, Octavius has his ceremonial sword. Philip Church, the American, named for Philip Schuyler, has his musket. They have the cockade on the hat to signify his military rank. We have our feather and the macaroni feather in the hat for our American counterpart. So, placing them on an even keel. We the people, you the prince. So she is, taking this role in England, but she's not, she's an American. This is her letter to her sister in 1792. But what are kings and queens to an American who has seen a Washington? Her most significant political maneuvering, however, comes during the French Revolution. She has a house in London, and it becomes a haven for veterans of the American Revolution who are fleeing the guillotine. On the left, we have the Count of Noailles and his brother-in-law, the Marquis de Lafayette, in the middle. And on the right is Talleyrand, Prince Talleyrand, not yet Prince, but Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, who did not fight in the American Revolution, but his brother was the aide-de-camp to General Chastellux, who wrote the book. So Angelica knew him well. But she helps all three of these men during the Revolution. She helps the Count of Noailles get to North America. She tries to orchestrate a prison break for the Marquis de Lafayette when he's being held in Austria. At this point, the King of Austria is Marie Antoinette's brother, so that doesn't really work out so well. And then Talleyrand on the right, he was in England in a diplomatic role, but the French were like, we need him. He was so prominent. And England was like, he can't stay here. This is going to get us pulled into this war. We want nothing to do with it. He has got to leave. And Angelica arranged for him to go to New York. And he did. He went to New York. He went to Albany, and her family helped him. He hated the United States, but he came and he wrote her. He really credited her with his life, and that becomes very important later, because when her cousin Robert R. Livingston is negotiating the Louisiana Purchase with our Monsieur Talleyrand, Robert Livingston is like, Angelica, keep writing me letters to remember that relationship that he had. So this is sort of her there isn't an American diplomat in England at this point. The Adams have left, and for years she's lobbying for her father to be made ambassador, or Alexander Hamilton or someone. But in the meantime, she's, in many ways filling the role. This is a letter she writes to Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, lobbying for protection for the Count of Noailles in the States. She met Thomas Jefferson in Paris. She and John Trumbull went on a jaunt and spent the winter in Paris with their friends after a few years, to catch up with their war friends. And that winter, the draft of the Constitution had come. The Marquis de Lafayette is there. Thomas Paine is there. Angelica Church is there. Thomas Jefferson. They're all debating this document. And so afterwards, she maintains a correspondence with Thomas Jefferson and a friendship that's, they're very intimate. And then she capitalizes on it later. I mean, she really is a networker, an influencer of her time period. And then in 1797, she goes home to New York. They go in with a bang. They take Government House, which is the house that New York built for George Washington before, Alexander Hamilton sold the Capitol down the swamp. They're announced in the paper. They're coming back, supposedly extremely wealthy. He's been trading U.S. bank shares in England. They'd made a lot of money during the war. They still theoretically had that. It was maybe a little bit of a con, but they were going for appearances when they arrived. But it was, 1797 was a highly partisan period in New York history, and there was a lot of anxiety that French Revolution type chaos might ensue. And Thomas Jefferson writes her, I hope you will help us, spread your mantle of the good across the, to help keep the peace here. So she does what she can. Most significantly, she's bridging the aisle. She is a friend of Thomas Jefferson's. She's a friend of Alexander Hamilton. They both consult her. They both write to her. They both sort of talk about her world as being the place they would most like to be, the society that she creates. You know, the government is designed to support the society. That's its role. And they're talking about that. They're like, government work is like trash work. It's horrible. It's miserable. Everybody's arguing all the time. But the reason we do it is so that society can be lovely. And women are running society in New York, right? Like they're the ones who are deciding what kind of social world they're going to have in a republic. That has to get designed too, right? We don't have we're not there drafting documents to be like, this is how a democracy will function socially. Like they're inventing it as they go. They have their Republican court, they have their levies, they're trying different things out. Some of it works, some of it doesn't. But she's there in that space between them. Robert R. Livingston, her cousin, is a Jeffersonian. Her father is a Federalist, like Alexander Hamilton. Like she just is occupying the space between parties, to the extent that when her husband fights a duel with Aaron Burr, who's his colleague at the Manhattan Company, then they go to New Jersey and shoot at each other it's easier than talking. And when they get back, she takes Aaron Burr as her guest to a party. Obviously, no one got killed in that duel, but just to manifest that peace. The fighting has happened, it's over, and now we behave like friends, because that's the most important thing. And at that party, the source I have for the Aaron Burr anecdote is Josephine DuPont of the DuPont Chemical later on. But her husband has been, has had a diplomatic role. They're kind of staying in New York to avoid Napoleon. But her father-in-law is the man who carries Thomas Jefferson's offer to buy Louisiana. In fact, convinces him to make the offer, suggests to Jefferson, who's ready to threaten Napoleon with war, hey, why don't you just offer him some money and maybe we could do this more peaceably. And then he carries that letter instead of the one Jefferson was hoping he would carry to Napoleon when he returns to France and begins that negotiation. So she's up in all of these events. I say sometimes that she's the Forrest Gump of the American Revolution. She just manages to be absolutely everywhere things are going on. And I ask myself a lot of the time, is that just a coincidence, or is this a matter of the lens through which we're looking at the events, or just the way we've been taught to read them, or the names we have for things? If we don't have a name for that work of standing between, vying political parties that are on the brink of both parties, you won't believe this, both parties are really convinced that the other one is trying to destroy the country and will inevitably and shortly do so. She's the person who's getting in the middle of that, standing between the parties. And here's sort of the penultimate example of this that we've all heard of. And this is July 11th, 1804. This is the letter she writes from the Bayard's house after Alexander Hamilton has come back, been rowed across the river, after he duels with the vice president. I have the painful task to inform you that General Hamilton was this morning wounded by that wretch Burr. She's no longer taking him to parties. The town is in consternation, and there exists only the expression of grief and indignation, and this is important. When you have such fractious partisanship, and the sitting vice president shoots and kills the leader of the opposite political party, you have the makings of a French Revolution type mob chaos scenario. But Angelica Church and Gouverneur Morris, who's also a friend of hers, who was the minister plenipotentiary to France during the French Revolution, but often spent that time in Angelica's house in London because it was just way more comfortable. They run the funeral, and they run a funeral that has the gravitas that you need to recognize what has happened, but doesn't incite chaos and doesn't incite the sort of upheaval that could potentially destroy the country. So that's the pattern that I found with her life in general that surprised me, because I didn't know it. When you have someone who's your hero and you're a kid, you kind of don't want to research them, right? You're like, okay, I get to pretend I'm her when I'm like leaping around on hay bales in my otherwise not romantic life. But as an adult, you're like, I don't know, if you just dig in there, it might go badly. And, and it's true. She is an enslaver, and she's a very privileged woman. And she, was obviously very self-assured that she'd be like, Prince of Wales, come to my house for my party. Um, uh, but when I found this pattern of behavior, of stepping in between adversarial parties, and being that go-between, being that liaison, being that interpreter, being that mutual friend, um, I just realized that we just don't have words for that. We laud our generals, and we laud our presidents, and we laud the people who sign the documents, but we maybe don't spend enough time looking at the peacemakers, and she's one of them. So that's what I have on her, but I'm looking forward to your questions because I know a lot of you out there know this history well, and I'm curious to know what we have.
Hi. I was wondering if you could go on a little bit about Angelica's relationship with Alexander Hamilton. I know there was a lot of, speculation.
Yeah, right to the point.
So just curious what your take is on it.
Absolutely, I'd love to answer that question. Angelica was a woman whose currency was her friendship with people and her reputation as a high status woman. In her lifetime, Abigail Adams, who we love, was maybe partly behind it. There were salacious rumors about her and Alexander Hamilton. They're very public figures. She's, the Frenchness never wears off. She's always kind of Marie Antoinetting. But I would note that Marie Antoinette was also accused of sleeping with her brother-in-law. That was a common complaint. And in fact, one story that I get into in the book as sort of not a counter argument, but an example, is that there is an ambassador from France who comes to New York, and he brings his sister-in-law to New York as he's not married, so his brother's wife comes with him, and her son, who she wants to have educated in the U.S., and so she's going to serve as his housekeeper while he's ambassador to the U.S. And New York is having none of it. They're like, this is not an okay relationship. Thomas Jefferson, actually, who likes him and likes her and had really recommended them, had to negotiate to have her recalled because New York had so completely shut the door on her because they felt that this relationship with a sister-in-law was inappropriate. So what I'm trying to say is that I think that if there was any real substantial grounds for there to be a relationship, she calls him her brother in her letters, my dear brother, to have had a relationship, if it was in any way verified, it would have destroyed both of their reputations in public. And I sincerely believe that. There's also an issue of timelines. Like if you look at, books that do talk about when they might have had a relationship. So she leaves the United States in 1783. She comes back one time. This will not surprise you. George Washington's inauguration. For the ball. She misses the ceremony, but she's there in time for the balls. And some people who were there were like, it was hard to tell who was the center of attention, George Washington or Angelica Church. So she's there that summer, and that would probably, if there was a relationship, it was probably that she left her kids and her husband in England, and she came back for the inauguration, and she hasn't been back in years because she's always pregnant. Her husband had sailed back to pick up their younger children who they'd left with their parents. So it's her first time back, and that's, I'm going to mess up, 1789, and then she doesn't come back again until 1797. So yes, they're writing each other letters, but they're on different continents, which is prohibitive. Especially then, long boat ride. You're not exactly sneaking out for, an afternoon. So I mean, maybe something will come to light. I know people like to say her younger son looks like him, but he was born in the summer of 17, really too close to her getting off the boat for that to have been possible. Anyway, so I don't see anything material. I know they had detractors who I know that, part of me, I would sell more copies of the book if I could have found that. If it could have been a little steamier. But, and ditto, Thomas Jefferson, like there are people who have said like, well, why would like, it's the reductive answer to the question, why were these people paying all this attention to her? Like, who was she sleeping with? And that's not compelling either. I think Thomas Jefferson really admired her as being this sort of like model American woman, and Jefferson's idea of what a model American woman should be was leaned conservative even for their time. I mean, he really was sure women should stay. I mean, he's really, I would credit with being the person who got the word men in that document. This being someone whose like main relationship in his life was an enslaved woman, whom he never freed. Like that's real. So yeah, no, I don't find anything. I'm sorry. It would make a much better movie.
Yes, it's amazing that you grew up in the city that you have written the book about. I think that's rather remarkable. My question is, how long did it take you to research and to write this book? And then how would you contrast the relationship with Thomas Jefferson?
Contrast it with
With
Alexander
like
Hamilton.
Alexander Hamilton, because there was some affectionate going on, affection going
Yeah,
on. And I don't know
no, for
how
sure.
deep that was.
I mean, in the end, she takes the side of Alexander Hamilton. He is her brother. So the loyalty there for her with family runs deep. But I will say that one of the ways that Angelica worked her networks was to sort of extend family. So when she went to Paris with John Trumbull, she took her daughter, Catherine, Kitty, who was John Trumbull's goddaughter, and she enrolled her in school with the Jefferson girls, in the convent with the Jefferson girls. And then she returned. She was there for the winter, but then she went back to London, and her daughter remained in Paris for the rest of the school year with the Jefferson girls. And Thomas Jefferson would pick the girls up on Sunday, and they would all go to his house, and they'd be, he'd write to Angelica and report on their progress speaking French. So she created family bonds with people, even if in that way. So Governor Morris, when he was minister plenipotentiary, he was godparent to her son, Alexander Hamilton. And yeah, so she was always sort of knitting people together with family. And then the town where I'm from. Let me remember, you're back to your question. So one, I have to laugh when you call it a city, because it really has 3,000 people who live there, and most of them right now are Amish. But I'm telling you, I had a desk at the back of this defunct antique store in town where I started this book in about 2016. That was your question. I got there. I was still up there. How long it took me. I started it in 2016. My mother asked me to come home to Angelica, and she promised me free childcare, which is, if you want something done, man, babysit. So I had a workspace and I had a babysitter, and I came home and I just got started looking through just general. I mean, we have all these archives in our town library, and then at Angelica's house, they have kept and gathered so many of her things and copies of letters that are everywhere. So they just had a trove of material at her house, which they just do as a hobby, as a project. So the research, took me a long time, and the writing took me a long time. But it was partly because there was so much quantity, not because it took a long time to find it. It was more that I thought there were no documents about women. Turns out, I was wrong. It just was massive. There were so many things, and I could have, if my publishers had let me go on and on, you would have not been able to lift this book up. So you can thank them. But it took me, so 2016 I started it, 2026 we're talking about, it came out last summer. A lot of that is not a lot, but a year of that is publishing time. So, they say it takes 10 years to write a biography. Mine's not one of the really fat biographies, but I have 3 small children and a job. So it's not like I was doing it full time.
Well, I'll apologize. I've not quite finished the book yet. So if you've got the,
But there was a quiz. They didn't tell you?
darn that I fail. So if you've got the information in there, I apologize that I just haven't gotten to that yet. I'm kind of wondering about Angelica with Lafayette when he came back for his tour.
Mhm.
First, I think the idea that Lafayette came back that long afterwards is kind of ridiculous. Anyway, something like 50 years.
In 1824, I think, when he did his return
1824 in
tour.
there. But I'm wondering if, because of her social things and that there's anything that, it helped spark her back to her social hierarchy.
When he returned. Okay, well, the sad news is that by 1824, she had been dead for a decade. She died young. She's 58. So she wasn't, but when Lafayette, the rumor is in the family, I don't have Lafayette's word on this, but that Lafayette recognized her granddaughter in a crowd during that reunion tour. But they were definitely good friends. There's this, when they were all in White Plains for the trial after Fort Ticonderoga, but Lafayette was very ill, and Angelica's uncle was taking care of him. He had a hemorrhagic fever. It sounds really disgusting. And he came to Boston to sail back to France. And spent time with the Carters. And it just talks about her uncle had prescribed that he drink a lot of Madeira to treat his hemorrhagic fever, and Angelica helped him with that. That was sort of like when they became friends. And then, they were friends. So during the war, after the war, and through, they remained close for the rest of her life. He tried, after Alexander Hamilton was killed, Lafayette was like, honey, come to France. Like, it's, come be with your friends here. We can make you happy. So even then, they're still talking about that. They were very close.
In our class at Grand Valley, we're reading the Bill of Obligations, which is a great book to read right now.
Okay.
And on Monday, we're doing civility, that democracy would be strengthened with greater civility. And I've heard you mention that word several times in connection with Angelica. And I'm wondering, with your experience of her and her life, as you look around now, what examples do you see? I mean, we've already come up with the giving to the president of the Nobel Peace Prize as an example of informal persuasion. I was wondering what you see in the contemporary landscape that reminds you of the work that she has done.
Well, I mean, I think we could use a few of her. Like an army, maybe? No, I mean, I'm serious. Like, I mean, I think about, the Revolutionary War was in many ways a civil war, right? And the French Revolution is a civil war, and the upheaval in the transition from the federalism to Jeffersonian, the Jeffersonian era was a really fraught time period. And there was, New England was going to secede, and everyone was breaking the country. It was such a new country. It was just this little baby, sad country that you didn't even know. We were making it up as they went, and so the idea that it could be held together. I mean, Britain was really sure that by 1812 it was coming back. And Angelica would encounter those people in England who were like, well, it's just a matter of time. The Americans, like, they'll be back. They can't do this. So yes, they're building a society, and they're trying to imagine what that is. that corresponds with the government that they've built. It's also an era of manners. They talk about George Washington copying down his etiquette book, right? That he was very interested in points of etiquette, and Thomas Jefferson sort of followed that with his Republican virtue and like that how we deport ourselves. So it's really baked into the system, and everyone was pretty sure that for things to work, people had to perform manners in these ways.
Okay, right down
Maybe they
here.
were wrong.
I just wondered if you could talk, what was your overall impression as to whether or not her marriage was happy or not? And just at the end of the book, there isn't a lot, after everybody dies, the last 10 years or so of her life. So it didn't sound like they actually lived together for a lot of that period of time in the last years and so forth. So, I know that a woman couldn't divorce her husband or anything,
Right.
but she certainly had lots of kids. But I just wondered if you had a feeling about what was going on there.
I mean, I think separation was sometimes like birth control. I mean, like her father would. So Angelica's born, Elizabeth's born, Peggy's born, and his wife is pregnant when Philip Schuyler sailed to England after the French and Indian War for a year and a half. After he'd been gone for the war. So, I mean, I think people actually, there would be a voyage or there would be a war. I mean, I think there was a lot of separation anyway, because otherwise you would have so many children, more children. So I think there was some norm for that, for there to be separation. But her relation, so I'm like, this is a huge question for me. Like John Barker Church is a super enigma. People didn't like him, but did they not like him because he was just a grocer? Or did they not like him because he was like not a very nice guy? It's hard to separate that because the rank and status, and if you're a proper gentleman, you don't do work, is so deeply baked into the social order that's being replaced by the revolution, but hasn't yet been replaced. So disentangling that is difficult. The privateering, some people frowned at that. Although Bostonians were privateering mad, and Ben Franklin was egging them on because he thought it was really causing England a headache. Then he was working for the French army. He worked very hard. He never left them. He didn't go with his wife when she had a baby. He left. There's one time when he leaves. It's the French army is marching to New York because it's after Yorktown, but the British still hold New York, and they're just going to go be near New York so that Britain doesn't remove troops from New York and take them to the West Indies where the war is now hotter. So they're marching north, and it's just horrendous conditions. The horses are dying, and then people all get fevers. And Angelica and her sister Peggy on the march almost to Philadelphia get a really bad fever. I mean, the doctors who write to her husband, who's gone ahead with the army, with the front to prepare for the army's arrival, write to him like they're in really bad shape. And she isn't able to walk for months. And he comes for like 24 hours to. He separates from the army for like 24 hours to go see his wife, who has and baby, who have nearly died of this fever. But he's able to get his colleague, Jeremiah Wadsworth, to come from Connecticut to take his place for those few days while he leaves. I'm exaggerating. He was there longer. He's also there to talk to Robert Morris in Philadelphia. And he eventually winds up being hired to supply the American army as well as the French army. So he makes a ton of money. So is that war profiteering or not? So people call him a mere man of business. So financially, people find it questionable. But Thomas Paine writes in a tract about the banks and crediting the Bank of North America, for winning the war. After Yorktown, there's no money to keep the Continental Army together, and that's why they're, in Philadelphia, Martha Washington, fresh from her son's grave, to lobby Congress to just get enough money to keep the army together, because otherwise Britain's going to come back next summer and the summer after and it's, just a money game. And Wadsworth and Morris and John Carter form a bank and, do little financial magic to fund the Continental Army. Another season. So, and he made a ton of money doing that. So, is he helping the war, or is he helping himself? It's hard to know what's in a person's heart. As to them, the elopement leans in his favor. I mean, she was a very intelligent, which didn't always help you, but she's a very high status woman. I'm sure she had a lot of options. So why she would elope with this guy who has no family connections, owns no land, has no any of the things that she's supposed to be looking for, and most of all is not Dutch, is significant. But a lot of the letters between the two of them are missing. So I don't ever see them talking to each other. But I do see him talking about her. She needs me to stay with her. She doesn't want to move into the city because she thinks that I'll leave, which is true. Her wanting him to be with her, that seems significant. I even think the fact that he was like, if you and John Trumbull want to go to Paris for the winter, fantastic, have fun. She'd lost a baby. I think she was sort of coming off of that sadness, and so sort of a cheer up event. I think they were maybe really well suited. I think they were a power couple, and that her prominence and his Englishness, and he was in Parliament for a while, so she, can network between Americans who want to come, for example, John Jay, to do the Jay Treaty, and she can help him go meet the king, help him go meet with people who are in Parliament. They can come have dinner at her house and talk, in those private spaces where people can do the beginnings of negotiations. She's running that. So I kind of feel like they were good. I mean, when the baby's conceived right after the peace treaty arrives, I sort of feel like people are having fun.
So I was just wondering, so we see in Angelica's earlier life that she had been much closer with the British government, even living in a governor's household. How exactly did she go from that sort of position to full-fledged independence?
To join the revolution on the Patriot side? It's a really good question because, again, we're dealing with family units, and the family unit means something really different at this time period. We think a lot about individual people being individual people, and at this time period, the family is more of a unit. In the sense, part of that is patriarchal. The father is the king of the family and makes the decision. So it's not all. It does. I don't mean to make it sound like they were all closer families back then. I mean that it was. It didn't conceive of individual parties in quite the same way. So the family made an announcement. They were in Saratoga when the news came about the shots fired at Lexington and Concord, and the family conferred. And her father wrote a letter to have sent to England, to a friend who was heading to England, declaring the family for the Patriot side of the war, and then immediately rode to Philadelphia, where he was made a general in the war. So their immediate family was very quick to side with the cause. Now, people suspected Philip Schuyler of having mixed agenda. There was a rumor after General Burgoyne took Fort Ticonderoga the week of Angelica's wedding, that how he took it was that he fired silver cannonballs over the rampart walls, and Philip Schuyler just ran around and collected them and then let him have the fort, which is categorically fake news. But no, the family, but not everybody. I mean, she had members of her family who did not. One of the men so the Chief Justice of New York, William Smith Jr., is married to, he's married to Janet Livingston, whose brother Robert Livingston, not that Janet Livingston, not that Robert Livingston, and his married to her, William Smith's sister, Susanna. So there's two families in New York. And anyway, they help raise Angelica. So the Chief Justice of New York doesn't back the revolution. He backs, or not independence. He backs the revolution. He stops at independence. So people, like, this was not everybody was like, yay, we're all on the same side here. It was, you've met this country. That wasn't happening. Everybody was fighting, families were fighting, everyone was arguing about like what this would look like. And so the Smiths for a while, because they're connected to the Livingston family, were allowed to remain in New York at Livingston Manor, sort of like under the care of the family. But then finally New York was like, yeah, no, you got to go. Like we can't have loyalists. And so he had to cross, his family got sent across actually Aaron Burr escorted them to New York City across the line of demarcation. So even within her family, and she would go visit him at this, while he was in sort of house arrest, Angelica would go visit him. So she had lots of friends and acquaintances who were loyalists. And like I said, it was a civil war. But she doesn't, the girl stayed her path.
It seemed like Angelica had a lot of power in a time when women weren't allowed to have opinions about politics. Like, how did she get people like Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton to like really listen to her? And did she have a lot of pushback, and how did she deal with that?
Thomas Jefferson wrote to her that he felt that the tender breasts of ladies were not made for politics explicitly, to a very political woman. But he also wrote to Abigail Adams, who was an extremely political woman. So he was a little bit like, I don't hear you. Okay, so here's what I think about it. I think women spend a lot of time now then like hiding their work, right? The teeny tiny stitches. I'm not sweating, I'm just glistening. My perfect children, I don't know, I guess they're just naturally that way. My immaculate house, oh, just effortless. My dinner party, effortless. We do this whole thing like I did no work. The skirt is designed to hide the work of walking. And women destroy their papers often, their letters. Elizabeth Hamilton got rid of all of her letters, or most of them. So there is a self-effacing, you don't want to be like, this is the patriarchy has made women, like, no, like women do the things you can't see. And part of it is aggrandizing your spouse, and part of it is getting men to do things that they think is their idea. It's an art form. They say she's flirtatious, and I think maybe that's what that means, is that so she's in Paris, and they're debating this draft of the Constitution, like whether it's the right thing. It doesn't have a Bill of Rights. It puts too much power in the executive. They're all convinced. Lafayette's like, this is the trap. They're all like, it's way too much power for the executive. And nobody says what Angelica says in that situation. But after she gets back to England, she sends Thomas Jefferson the copy of the Federalist Papers that Elizabeth has just sent to her. So I think she's subtle. I think she was subtle. I think, and I think she also felt, you're raised in a space where you're not supposed to be the person who's having that idea, but you're maybe draw that out. She's in Paris with the Saloniers, right? The Saloniers are up there like giving speeches themselves, but they're conducting the orchestra of that conversation that's taking place. Like, you artists, so you have to have the information to do that. And she had a great aunt who taught her, like, you have to read every day. You have to read serious books every single day, a part of your day, because you are going to have to sit at tables with people who are powerful people, and you need to be interesting, but also like you need to participate in the conversation as a member of that gathering, and you have to be prepared to do so. So that's what my read on it. But I also think that women did have. I think we tend to think of things as being linear, like women situation was like 90% worse than right now, than 80%, than 70%, than 60%, whatever. But it doesn't work like that. it has been a pendulum forever. Whenever there's a war, the women are suddenly out in the workforce and they're taking on massive roles in like public roles. And then the war ends and everyone buys them a new washing machine. I mean, we're seeing a pendulum swing right now. I mean, it doesn't, the Victorian era follows this era of, I mean, it's not bra burning, but they did lose the corset. And like, you know, they wore those Grecian gowns that would show your natural form and everyone's breastfeeding. And like, you have this really, I mean, then you have the free loving, like libertines, you know, in Europe. Like, so you have this one period that's taking place during the revolution, and people are, I mean, you've got Mary Wollstonecraft, you've got Olivia, I'm not going to get her last name, Cortese, you've got all these books that are coming out about women's rights, the vindication of the rights of women. People are talking about it. It's getting printed in newspapers in the United States. What are these equal rights are going to go to women? And everyone's hot on that. And then and then the Jeffersonian era comes, and you get the button up, and you get your mutton sleeves, and there's a swing back. Women were shocked. There were people who expected to have the right to vote, to be participating. Women did vote immediately after the war, and then gradually those it went away, and it became, women lost citizenship rights. It became voter fraud. They were accusing women of voter fraud for voting. You know, so it, you know, that pendulum swing, it's always been swinging. So I don't think it's linear. I think she lived in a period where women had a moment of a lot of power and a lot of freedom, and I think that phase ceased and has come back, and you know, since then.
I understand the distinction you're making, that the women aren't and haven't been recognized at the time of war, but I'm wondering, and you certainly have done a great job of putting a spotlight on the contributions. I'm wondering, to what extent were the serious historians aware of and talking about her in the aftermath of her death? In the first 50 or 100 years, did the serious people really recognize these contributions?
So the people around her, her compatriots, saved her letters, named a town after her. She was seen in her lifetime as someone who was prominent and influential. And then pretty soon after the war, I feel like there was a movement to tell, well, even in their lifetime, like I'm thinking of like Lucy Knox, and Katie Green, and you know, and basically the whole Revolutionary War generation. And I think men and women experience this after wars too. Like the generation that fights the war, like expects to be celebrated. Like, we just fought this war for you, kids. And then their kids are like, okay, mom, God, you told me already. And the kids are trying to like make their own lives, and so there is a sense that people were very quickly not appreciated after the Revolutionary War, except for some of the sort of like aggrandized stories. So you have people who were very involved. Robert R. Livingston, for example, you know, helps draft the Declaration of Independence. He's a congressman. He's the Secretary of Foreign Affairs to the Continental Congress, and then he's the Minister to France who negotiates the Louisiana Purchase. He's not someone we really study. I mean, he's got some weird characteristics too, but we don't hear a lot about him. Gouverneur Morris, who was, you know, had a peg leg from, well, he said it was he let people believe it was from jumping out of a lover's window, but he actually got caught in a carriage wheel. But he too was a very influential congressman and the minister to France during the Revolution, and involved in drafting the Constitution, and was the person who really lobbied for slavery to be against the 3/5 clause in the Constitution. You know, he was like, you know, if we're going to count slaves that way, we need to count the houses in Philadelphia, which are worth more than you know, in dollar significance than than the enslaved. So he really pushed back on codifying slavery in that, but we don't talk about him either. So there has been, there's always selection, elimination, and emphasis in the telling of history, and so that happened pretty quickly. I do think there was that pendulum swinging against women happened in her lifetime. Part of this is Jeffersonian virtue and where Jefferson felt that women needed to be. They could talk about it as a revolutionary backlash. So there was some silencing that happened in her time period. So her role in the revolution itself, because she's 20, right, in 1776, she's a kid, kind of like Alexander Hamilton, who, if he hadn't had a long career later or wouldn't be remembered for his military service in the Revolution, right? He fought a 10-minute battle, and that's the beginning and the end of his. They took one route out. So he wouldn't be someone who, if he hadn't had the longer career later, wouldn't necessarily get the same sort of conversation. And he also had periods in which he hasn't been talked about a lot. These stories come and go. So there are, Susan Fenimore Cooper wrote a biography of Angelica's mother, for example. So there were people who were writing about, trying to get these stories down about these women. But in terms of what we mean by serious historians, serious historians were telling a very specific story about with political ends about how the country was formed, as I do. I mean, I see her story because I'm looking for a particular. I really wanted to know what women's power looked like, and that's the story I went looking for. And I didn't know what I'd find, and I didn't know what it would look like, or if it would be something that I want to be like, hey, let's try that. But we are always looking for something from the time in which we're writing, and so a lot of people are trying to justify or celebrate the revolution, and that was the initial impulse of the historical record. But the people who knew her, who were writing books about the time, certainly wrote about her. And her daughter wrote a book about the history of Louisiana. So there was her daughter herself was a serious historian, but she had eloped, and her parents didn't forgive her, ironically. All right, thank you so much, everybody. Really appreciate you.
Well, I think it's fair to say that we are all grateful, Molly, that you went looking for this story, and also that you were born in Angelica so that you could bring this wonderful life to us in this form. So thank you for your work. Thank you for sharing with us tonight. The more history I read, I will tell you, before I took this job, I liked history, but I can't tell you that I was an enthusiast. But the more I read it, and the more I think about the world we live in today, the more parallels we find. And I heard a lot of murmuring in the crowd tonight, and some snickers sometimes, as we think about what happened 250 years ago and where we find ourselves today. So my admonition for all of us is to continue diving into the stories, find the people that maybe weren't written about 142 times, but maybe once, and think about the places in our own lives where we can step into leadership and not necessarily wait for it to come to us. So that is my encouragement for all of us. Talk about this. We have a lovely dessert reception for you. We have book sales and signing with Molly out in the lobby. So as you leave tonight, I encourage you to have those conversations. Again, thank you all for coming out. Please join us on President's Day, February 16, for a luncheon. We will feed you and bring you a great conversation with Jeff Engel from SMU, who will be talking about historically how America has chosen to go to war. So again, we thank you so much tonight. We'll see you in a couple weeks. Drive safe and enjoy your evening.